The wind howled over the fields carrying the scent of sweat, steel, and fear. In the distance, the banners of England flapped defiantly against the horizon, facing the proud lilies of France. This was not just another battle, it was the opening act in a war that would last more than a century. The 100 Years' War was not merely a clash of armies, but a collision of identities, dynasties, and destinies that would shape Europe forever. From the first claim to the French crown, to the final cannon blasts echoing across the fields of Castillon, this was a saga of ambition and betrayal. Kings would fall, peasants would rise, and nations would be born from fire and blood. Every arrow loosed, every sword swung, every treaty signed left a mark on the future. And yet, for all its battles, this was also a war of ideas about who had the right to rule, about what it meant to be French or English, about the very nature of power. To understand the birth of modern Europe. And so, we begin. It began in 1328, when the death of Charles IV of France left the Capetian dynasty without a direct male heir. By French laureated in the ancient Celtic traditions, succession could only pass through the male line. But Edward III of England, grandson of Philip IV of France, through his mother, claimed the throne, sparking outrage among the French nobility. To them, Edward was a foreign king, unworthy of ruling France. Philip VI, cousin of the late Charles, was crowned instead, setting England and France on a collision course. This dispute was not a simple quarrel, it was a matter of legitimacy, national pride, and control of one of Europe's most powerful kingdoms. Edward's claim was more than ambition. It was a calculated challenge to French authority. And Philip knew that if Edward's claim stood, France's independence would be shattered. Economic tensions only poured fuel on the fire. England relied heavily on the export of wool to Flanders, a region loyal to France. Philip VI's interference in Flanders trade angered Edward, threatening England's wealth. Soon, trade wars became political wars, and political wars became armed conflict. The stage was set for a struggle that neither kingdom could afford and neither was willing to avoid. In 1337, Edward formally declared himself King of France, his seal bearing the arms of both kingdoms. To the French, it was an insult that could not be ignored. To the English, it was the restoration of a rightful claim. The 100 Years' War had begun not with a sword stroke, but with a royal signature. The early years of the war were marked by naval skirmishes and raids rather than large-scale battles. The English fleet scored a decisive victory at Sluys in 1340, crippling French naval power for decades. This gave Edward control of the Channel and allowed England to strike deep into French territory without fear of maritime retaliation. It was the beginning of England's military dominance. Raids known as devastated the French countryside. English commanders burned villages, destroyed crops, and terrorized the population to weaken France's economic base. These brutal tactics not only caused famine and suffering, but also eroded the French king's authority among his people. For the peasantry, war became an unending nightmare. Yet, France was not without victories of its own. French knights, armored in steel and mounted on powerful destriers, remained a fearsome force in open combat. The problem was not bravery, but leadership. The French nobility often clung to outdated chivalric tactics, charging headlong into English longbow fire. This stubbornness would cost them dearly in battles to come. By the mid-1340s, the war had escalated from a dispute over succession into a continental conflict. Alliances with Scotland, the Low Countries, and even the Holy Roman Empire meant that the war's web stretched far beyond France and England. Europe itself was becoming a chessboard, with kings and dukes as the pieces. The summer of 1346 saw Edward III lead a daring invasion of Normandy. French forces under Philip VI scrambled to assemble a counterattack. On August 26th, at a small village called the Two Armies, met in a clash that would redefine medieval warfare. The English, vastly outnumbered, positioned themselves on a slope, their longbowmen forming a deadly wall of arrows. The longbow was England's secret weapon, capable of piercing armor at 200 yards and firing up to 6 arrows per minute. Against the disciplined volleys, French cavalry charges shattered. Horses fell screaming, their riders crushed beneath the weight of men and steel. The battlefield became a graveyard of knights. Among the fallen were many of France's most esteemed nobles, a devastating blow to morale. Even the Genoese crossbowmen hired by Philip were no match for the relentless English firepower. The French king himself barely escaped the slaughter, his army broken and humiliated. Was not just a victoriate, was a statement that the age of the armored knight was ending. In the aftermath, Edward marched to Calais, laying siege to the city. The war was changing, and so was the nature of power in Europe. England's longbow had proven that strategy and innovation could topple even the mightiest of medieval forces. After the victory, Edward III turned his attention to the strategically vital port of Calais. Controlling Calais would give England a permanent foothold in France, allowing them to move troops and supplies across the Channel with ease. The siege began in September 1346 and dragged on for nearly a year, testing the endurance of both sides. The city's walls were strong, and its people determined. Inside Calais, food grew scarce. The French crown attempted several relief efforts, but English naval control cut off supplies. Disease and hunger took their toll on the citizens, who watched their hopes dwindle as the months passed. The defenders were heroic, but even heroism cannot fill empty bellies. Slowly, the city's resolve weakened. In August 1347, Calais surrendered under Edward's terms, which demanded the expulsion of most of its citizens. The famous tale of the burghers of Calais, who offered themselves as hostages to save the rest, became a symbol of civic sacrifice. Edward, influenced by his queen, spared their lives, rare moment of mercy in a brutal war. The port became an English stronghold for more than 2 centuries. The capture of Calais cemented England's dominance in northern France and humiliated the French monarchy. It was a wound that would fester for decades, and a reminder that the English war machine was not just about battles, it was about strangling France's economy and trade. But fate was about to intervene in the form of a plague that cared nothing for crowns. In 1347, the Black Death swept across Europe, killing millions and halting the momentum of war. The plague did not discriminate between noble and peasant, soldier and civilian, struck all alike. Armies dissolved as men fled or died, leaving empty castles and abandoned fields. The 100 Years' War entered a grim intermission. Its fires banked, but not extinguished. For both England and France, the plague was a disaster beyond measure. Populations were slashed by 1/3 or more, agricultural output collapsed, and tax revenues dried up. Even victorious armies found themselves too weakened to hold newly conquered lands. The war's focus shifted from offense to survival. In France, the devastation compounded political instability. Local revolts flared as desperate peasants resisted taxation and feudal duties. In England, the death toll sparked labor shortages that empowered the working class, subtly changing the social fabric. The plague, though not a weapon of war, reshaped the battlefield nonetheless. When fighting resumed in the 1350s, the world was not the same. Both kingdoms were poorer, their manpower reduced, and their people weary of endless conflict. Yet the claims to the French crown had not been resolved, and ambition rarely dies quietly. The war's second phase was about to begin, and it would be bloodier than the first. Edward, the Black Prince, eldest son of Edward III, emerged as England's brightest star in the renewed war. In 1356, he led a daring campaign through southwestern France, pillaging and challenging French authority. His forces were small but disciplined, composed of veteran longbowmen and hardened men-at-arms. The French king, Joan II, moved to intercept. The two armies clashed near Poitiers in September 1356. Outnumbered, the Black Prince used the terrain to his advantage, positioning his troops in a narrow defile. French cavalry charges were funneled into killing zones, where English arrows and counterattacks tore them apart. The chaos of the battle eroded French discipline and morale. King John II fought bravely but was surrounded and captured, along with thousands of his knights. His capture was a catastrophe for France, its ruler, now a prisoner in England, its government in disarray. The ransom demanded for his release was enormous, further draining French resources. Poitiers, demonstrated the lethal combination of English tactics and French overconfidence. For England, the victory was glorious, but also complicated. Holding the French king gave them leverage in negotiations, but it also prolonged the war. France refused to break entirely, and a new wave of resistance rose under the Dauphin, Charles. The war was no longer a sprint, it was a grinding marathon. In 1360, after years of exhausting campaigns, both kingdoms agreed to the Treaty of England, gained vast territories in France, including Aquitaine, and Edward III renounced his claim to the French crown, at least on paper. In exchange, France agreed to pay an enormous ransom for King John II's release. The treaty seemed like a turning point toward peace. Yet, the ink was barely dry before tensions began to resurface. Many in France viewed the treaty as a humiliation, a temporary concession forced by weakness. The Dauphin, soon to be Charles V, quietly rebuilt the French army, reorganizing it to counter English tactics. The seeds of renewed conflict were already sown. In England, holding vast French lands proved costly and difficult. Garrisoning and defending them drained the treasury, and English lords grew restless under heavy taxation. While the treaty brought a pause in open fighting, it was an uneasy peace, more a truce than a true settlement. Both sides knew it could not last. By the mid-1360s, raids and border skirmishes were again common. France's recovery under Charles V, aided by skilled commanders like Bertrand du Guesclin, shifted the momentum. Charles V, crowned in 1364, proved a shrewd and cautious ruler. Avoiding direct battles where English longbowmen excelled, he focused on attrition and strategic sieges. Bertrand du Guesclin, his brilliant general, reclaimed towns one by one, slowly eroding England's holdings. English fortunes waned as political and financial troubles mounted at home. The Black Prince, ill and burdened by the cost of his campaigns, withdrew from active command. Without his leadership, English forces struggled to maintain their dominance. France's strategy of gradual reconquest was paying off. Naval power also shifted. French privateers disrupted English trade routes, while alliances with Castillon bolstered France's fleets. The English Channel, once an English stronghold, became contested waters again. War was no longer confined to land, it was now a battle for control of the seas. By the late 1370s, much of what England had gained in the Treaty of was lost. France's resilience was undeniable, and the war's momentum was firmly in their favor. But the struggle was far from over. A new chapter of turmoil and opportunity was about to open. While France regained strength, England was thrown into political unrest. Edward III's later years were marred by illness, court rivalries, and the growing influence of corrupt advisors. The Black Prince's poor health left a power vacuum, and Parliament clashed with the Crown over war funding. Discontent spread from the nobles to the commoners. The burden of heavy taxation to fund the war weighed heavily on the population. The once glorious victories of Poitiers felt like distant memories. Ordinary people began to question why so much blood and gold were being spent for lands across the Channel. In 1377, Edward III died, leaving the throne to his 10-year-old grandson, Richard II. The boy king inherited a fractured realm and a costly war. His reign began under the guidance of regents, but factionalism and mistrust weakened the kingdom's resolve. England's internal instability meant fewer troops and weaker campaigns in France. The English crown's authority was tested at home, while abroad its enemies pressed harder. The 100 Years' War was no longer a straight contest between two united kingdoms. It had become a struggle shaped by internal politics as much as by battlefield valor. By 1381, discontent erupted into open rebellion in England. The Peasants' Revolt, fueled by economic hardship, heavy taxation, and social inequality, saw thousands march on London. They demanded the end of serfdom and relief from crushing war taxes. The revolt exposed how deeply unpopular the war had become among commoners. For them, the 100 Years' War was a distant conflict fought for dynastic ambition. Yet, it was their fields, wallets, and families that paid the price. France, under Charles V, exploited this by intensifying pressure in contested territories. French forces recaptured town after town, while England hesitated, its leadership divided. The momentum that had once favored the English was slipping away faster than ever. War fatigue gripped both kingdoms, but in France, a more unified leadership meant resilience. In England, the rift between ruler and ruled widened. Even victories could not undo the weariness that decades of conflict had etched into the people's hearts. The late 14th century brought a shift in leadership for both nations. In 1380, Charles VI became King of France at just 11 years old, and in 1399, England saw the overthrow of Richard II by his cousin, Henry Bolingbroke, who became Henry IV. Henry IV's reign was troubled from the start. Domestic uprisings, border conflicts with Scotland, and questions over his legitimacy meant the French war was often sidelined. Meanwhile, in France, Charles VI's periodic bouts of mental illness weakened central authority. This mutual instability brought a lull in major battles. The war entered a phase of smaller raids and regional skirmishes, with neither side able to commit fully to conquest. That leader would soon arrive in the form of Henry V, a king whose ambition and martial skill would bring the war roaring back to life and whose victories would echo through the centuries. In 1413, Henry V ascended to the English throne, determined to revive England's fortunes in France. Charismatic, disciplined, and strategically brilliant, Henry saw the war as both a duty and a divine mission. France, still riven by internal strife between the Armagnac and Burgundian factions, was vulnerable. Henry seized the opportunity, launching a major invasion in 1415. His target was Harfleur, a key port in Normandy. But Henry's march to Calais was intercepted by a larger French force at Agincourt. Exhausted, outnumbered, and deep in enemy territory, the English seemed doomed. Henry's leadership and the deadly longbow turned the tide. Mud, narrow terrain, and disciplined ranks broke the French assault, resulting in a crushing English victory. Agincourt was more than a battle, it was a legend in the making. It restored English prestige, terrified the French, and cemented Henry V's reputation as one of England's greatest warrior kings. Following Agincourt, Henry V pressed his advantage relentlessly. The Burgundian faction allied with England, shifting the balance of power. French resistance crumbled in key regions, and Paris itself fell under Anglo-Burgundian control. The French king, Charles VI, was powerless to resist. In 1420, the Treaty of Troyes was signed, disinheriting the Dauphin Charles' future, Charles VII, and naming Henry V as heir to the French throne. To seal the deal, Henry married Catherine of Valois, daughter of Charles VI, for the first time. It seemed England might truly unite the crowns of both kingdoms. In 1422, Henry V died suddenly at the age of 35, leaving his infant son, Henry VI, as king of both England and France. The dream of permanent union was now in the hands of Regent Sand, in the shadow of a rising figure. In the darkest days for the Dauphin's cause, a young peasant girl, claimed she was sent by God to save France. Joan of Arc, armed with unshakable faith and a commanding presence, convinced Charles VII to give her a role in the army. Skepticism quickly turned to awe as she inspired the French to rally. In 1429, Joan led the relief of a turning point in the war. Her courage on the battlefield and her belief in divine mission electrified French morale. The siege was broken, and within months, Charles VII was crowned at Reims, fulfilling one of Joan's prophecies and restoring legitimacy to his reign. Joan's rise was meteoric, but her fall was swift. Captured by Burgundian allies of the English in 1430, she was handed over to her enemies, accused of heresy and witchcraft. She was tried and burned at the stake in Rouen in 1431. Her death was intended to crush French spirit, but it only deepened their resolve. In 1453, at the Battle of Castillon, the French dealt the English a crushing defeat. Cannon fire tore through English ranks, and John Talbot, the last great English commander in France, was killed. The victory ended English hopes of regaining their French territories. Only Calais remained under English control, a lonely outpost that would not be lost until 1558. For France, the war's end was a moment of national rebirth. For England, it was the closing of a chapter marked by glory, ambition, and eventual loss. The 100 Years' War had transformed both nations. France emerged more unified under a strengthened monarchy, while England turned inward, soon to be consumed by its own wars of the roses. From the disputed crown of 1328 to the cannon fire at Castillon, the 100 Years' War was more than a series of battles. It was the crucible in which modern France and England were forged. Kings rose and fell, heroes and traitors were made, and the very nature of warfare evolved. If you believe history matters, like this video, share it with others who love learning, and subscribe for more deep dives into the events that shaped our world. Until next time, remember, the past is never truly past.